The first thing Dr. Velethik noticed about the human was that she never asked for anything. This was unusual. In 17 years of practicing medicine aboard the Yathara Medical Collective Station 3, Velethik had treated beings from 34 species, and every single one of them asked for things. Water, a lower light setting, an explanation of what was happening to their body. Beings in pain asked for relief. Beings in fear asked for reassurance. Even beings in comas somehow managed to make demands through the distress signals of their metabolic readings. Wanting things was the universal constant of medicine. It was the reason medicine existed. The human Corporal Marin Solis, retired, according to her intake file, had been brought in on an emergency transfer shuttle from a frontier skirmish zone 3 days ago. 72 hours. In that time she had consumed the meals placed before her, submitted to the post-operative scans with the patience of someone waiting for a slow transport, and slept approximately 6 hours per rotation, which Velethik's reference files indicated was low for the species, but within acceptable parameters for a human under stress. She had not complained once. She had not asked for anything once. She had, however, been visited by 11 different nurses in 11 different 3-hour windows, which was 9 more nurses than her care team required, and which had begun to interfere measurably with the rest of the ward's function. Velethik stood outside room 14 and read through the nursing log on his tablet, his secondary eyelids half closing in the expression his species used for professional bafflement. Nurse Thavi had stopped in to check the IV calibration 4 times. Nurse Orthan had spent 40 minutes there yesterday under the pretense of reviewing the post-surgical wound mapping, a task that should have taken 8 minutes at the outside. Even Nurse Praxilian, who had worked on Station 3 for longer than Velethik himself, and who had, in Velethik's estimation, approximately 0 warmth in her entire triple-lobed body, had logged 2 visits for reasons described only as patient observation, behavior anomalous. Behavior anomalous. From the species whose entire medical literature described them as difficult patients with poor compliance rates, high emotional volatility, and a pathological resistance to bed rest. Velethik pressed the door panel. The room was dim. Solis had asked, the one thing she had asked, and she'd phrased it as a question rather than a demand, which his staff had apparently found remarkable enough to note in the log, whether the overhead lights could be set to 30% during rest periods. A reasonable request that Velethik was now slightly embarrassed not to have offered proactively. He'd recalibrated the standard human comfort protocols after reading it. She was sitting up. Not in the assisted recline position the bed had been calibrated to hold her in, but upright, back against the wall, the surgical gown swapped for a thin compression layer that someone, probably Thavi, who had exceeded her authorized scope twice this week already, had retrieved from the supply lockers. The incision along Solis's left flank was covered by a healing membrane, visible as a slightly raised rectangle of pale material against the dark brown of her skin. Her left arm was in a partial immobilizer. Her right hand held a stylus, and she was writing something on the tablet that should, by Velethik's medical understanding, have been beyond comfortable reach. She looked up when he entered, not startled. She had heard him before the door opened, he realized. She'd been tracking the sound of his footsteps in the corridor. "Doctor," she said. "Corporal Solis." He approached the bed, checking his readings out of habit. Heart rate, 58 beats per minute, which his reference file said was low for a resting human, but which Solis had apparently maintained consistently since admission. Blood pressure, within acceptable parameters. The fluid balance from the surgery 3 days prior was resolving faster than projected. "You're ahead of schedule on the fluid clearance." "Good genes," she said. It was a human expression he didn't entirely parse, but her tone was mild rather than combative, so he let it rest. He pulled up the stool and sat, which he did for all his longer consultations. He'd found it helped with the power differential that patients perceived when a doctor stood over a bed. He'd read that somewhere, years ago, and tried it, and it had worked well enough that it became habit. Solis watched him do this with the expression his staff had apparently been cataloging under behavior anomalous. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was something quieter than that. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone who has noticed a small, deliberate kindness and does not intend to make a fuss about it. "I'm going to ask you directly," Velethik said, "because I find it more efficient. My nursing staff appears to find your room preferable to the rest of the ward. I would like to understand why." Solis was quiet for a moment. She set the stylus down on the tablet. "I don't know," she said. "You'd have to ask them. I've reviewed their logs. The explanations are not particularly illuminating." Something shifted in her face. The corners of her mouth moved fractionally, which his files noted as a human micro-expression of amusement. "What do their explanations say?" "Thavi says she finds the post-surgical wound presentation interesting from a xenobiology standpoint." He tapped his tablet. "Orthan submitted a report on the relative tension differentials in human versus Kithari healing membrane adhesion. Praxilian has written nothing coherent." "Praxilian's the one who brought me the compression layer," Solis said. Velethik looked up from the tablet. "That was an unauthorized retrieval of patient comfort supplies." "I know, I told her she didn't need to." A pause. "She did it anyway." He watched her. She looked back at him with the same quality of attention he'd noticed since the first examination, steady, unhurried, taking in more than she appeared to be taking in. "What were you writing?" he asked. She glanced at the tablet. "Ward layout, sight lines from this room, exit routing." The words landed strangely. He processed them. "That is not standard patient behavior." "No," she didn't apologize for it. "I like to know the shape of a place." Another pause, and this one had a different weight. "Where I came from, knowing the shape of a place was the difference between," she stopped, finished differently, "its habit." He looked at the tablet in her hand. She tilted it slightly so he could see. What he'd expected, anxiety, paranoia, the overmapping behavior his xenopsychology consult flagged in post-combat patients, was not what the diagram showed. The layout was precise and practical. She had marked not just exits but staff movement patterns based, he realized, on 3 days of observation through a single room's window and doorway. She had noted the shift change times. She had flagged 2 locations in the corridor outside as natural choke points. He stared at the diagram. This was not the compulsive fear mapping of a traumatized being. This was a professional assessment, as calm and thorough as a structural engineer's review of a building she'd been asked to protect. "Why choke points?" he asked, and his voice came out more carefully than he intended. Solis looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone is going to try to come through them," she said, "and I'd like to know who and when before they decide for me." The ward went quiet outside, a cart rolling past, someone's monitoring unit chiming softly. Velethik sat with the information and made himself think clearly. "You were in active combat theater when you were transferred here," he said. It was in the file, but he hadn't weighted it properly. "The skirmish zone, yes. The Yathara Collective is a neutral medical facility. We do not." "I know what you are," she said, and it wasn't sharp. It was reassuring, which was a strange quality for a patient to direct at a physician. "I'm not worried about the collective. I'm worried about who followed me here." He stared at her. She met the stare with the same untroubled directness she met everything else with. "I didn't ask to transfer here," she said. "I was transferred because the field unit needed the berth, which means there's a 2-day gap in my movement record between the skirmish zone and this station, and in my experience, 2-day gaps in movement records are when problems find you." She picked up the stylus again. "I've been wrong before. I hope I'm wrong now." She went back to her diagram. "That's why I've been mapping the exits." Velethik stood. He was not certain what to do with the conversation, so he did what he always did when uncertain. He acted on the information. He returned to his office and pulled up the station's external approach logs for the past 72 hours. At 3:40 that morning, a vessel had requested docking clearance under a standard commercial registry code. The registry code, when cross-referenced, resolved to a Dekari extraction firm. Dekari extraction firms did not, in Velithic's experience, dock at medical stations in the pre-dawn hours for commercial reasons. He sat for a long time looking at that entry. He looked at the rest of the log: standard transit traffic, supply vessels, a medical resupply shuttle, 2 personnel transports, and then 340, the one that was not what it claimed to be. He thought about Solis' diagram, the choke points, the exit routes, 3 days of quiet observation from a single room conducted while recovering from surgery while not asking for anything. Then he went back to room 14. Nurse Thavi was already there. She was adjusting the IV calibration, actually adjusting it this time, with the focused efficiency of someone who has found a legitimate reason to be somewhere she wanted to be anyway. Solis was watching her work with the expression that Velithic's brain was now cataloging as the human equivalent of a small, genuine warmth, not performed, not transactional, simply present. "No, the right artery mapping is different in your species," Thavi was saying, with the clipped enthusiasm she reserved for subjects she considered worth enthusiasm. "We have 3 primary and 4 secondary conduits on the left lateral. You have 2 primary, both larger diameter, which is why the pressure compensation reads higher in your baseline metrics than in most Kithari patients. We kept rechecking the calibration because we thought the equipment was drifting. The volume compensation runs through the larger vessels instead of distributing," Solis said. Thavi's head turned so fast her neck plating rattled. "You know xenobiology." "I know my own body." A slight shift. "Someone had to teach me what to tell medics when I was in the field. I've had to describe my own injuries to doctors who'd never treated a human before. You learn the vocabulary because the alternative is not being understood when it matters." "That's..." Thavi stopped. Her expression cycled through something complex. "That must have been frightening." "It was practical," Solis said, which Velithic had come to recognize was the way she described most things that had been frightening. "You learn what you need to learn." Velithic stepped into the room. Both of them looked up. "I have a question," he said to Solis, and then paused, because the question was complicated and he was not sure which part of it to start with. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "The Dekari vessel," he said. Something in her went very still, the way a great deal of effort can sometimes look like stillness. "When did it dock?" she asked. 3:40. She looked at the window. The station's exterior viewport showed the geometric regularity of the docking ring, the faint scatter of navigation lights. "How many personnel on the manifest?" "The manifest lists a crew of 4. "The manifest," she said, in a tone that suggested she found manifests charming in their optimism. "I am a physician," Velithic said, "not a security officer. The station has a security complement, but they are..." He paused. "They are 6 officers for a station of 400 residents, and they are not equipped for this kind of problem," Solis said. "No. But I'm assuming you're here because you've decided to tell me about it." "You already knew there was a problem," he said. "You mapped the choke points. I thought it seemed relevant to tell you what I knew." She was quiet, then, "Thank you," and she said it the way people said things they actually meant without decoration. It sat in the air, differently than gratitude usually sat. Thavi was still standing at the IV line, her hand resting on the calibration unit, watching Solis with the expression that Velithic was finally beginning to understand. It wasn't fascination with xenobiology. It wasn't professional interest. It was something he hadn't quite had the vocabulary for until this moment, standing in this dim room, watching a trained medical professional stare at a patient who had just thanked a doctor for a piece of bad news. Thavi, who had spent 17 years treating people in pain, who had seen beings at their worst and most frightened and most demanding and most lost, had walked into room 14 3 days ago and found a person who was all of those things, injured, isolated, aware that danger was coming for her, and was sitting with all of those things quietly, without throwing them at anyone else. And it had undone something in her that she had not known was wound tight. It had undone something in all of them. "I need to make some calls," Solis said. She was already moving carefully with the deliberate precision of someone managing significant pain without acknowledgement. She swung her legs off the bed. Her feet found the floor. "You had abdominal surgery 72 hours ago," Velithik said. "Yes," she agreed. "You should not be standing." "Probably not." She was standing anyway, holding the IV stand as a counterbalance, testing her weight, evaluating what her body would and wouldn't give her right now. Her face was completely neutral during this evaluation. "I'll sit down as soon as I've secured the corridor." "You will," he stopped. "Corporal, this is a medical facility. You are a patient." She looked at him from across the room. The light was low, 30%. The dim that she'd asked for because she found the full station lighting fatiguing after years of dark field operations. He'd worked that out himself, reading between the lines of the intake file and the single small request she'd made. She stood in it like she'd been standing in low light her whole life, which he suspected she had. "I know," she said, "and everyone in this ward is your patient, which means they're my problem until this is over." She found the door panel with her free hand. "Send Praxilian if she's on shift. She has the right instincts." Then she opened the door and moved into the corridor. He sent Praxilian. He was not certain why he sent Praxilian. The correct response, by any institutional protocol he could point to, was to alert station security and keep all medical personnel clear of whatever was unfolding. But he went back to his office and he called station security and got the watch officer's recorded message, shift change. He had called at the exact wrong moment. And while he was deciding whether to escalate, Thavi appeared in his doorway. "The other nurses are asking," Thavi said. "Asking what?" "What they can do." She held his gaze for her. Velithik put the security communicator down. He thought about the layout diagram on Solis's tablet, the choke points marked in clean, efficient lines, the exit routes, the staff movement patterns she had assembled from 3 days of observation through a doorway while recovering from surgery, while not asking for anything. He thought about Thavi adjusting an IV that didn't need adjusting because she wanted to be in the room. He thought about Orthan and the wound membrane report in Praxilian, and the compression layer, and the fact that 11 different trained medical professionals had found reasons to be in room 14 over 3 days without quite understanding why. He understood why now. It was the same reason he had gone back to the room to tell her about the Dekari vessel, instead of simply alerting security and moving on. It was the reason the security watch officer's recorded message had felt, for just a moment, like a door opening rather than closing. She had not asked anyone for anything, and somehow that had made everyone want to give her something. "Tell them to cover the secondary care station near Junction 4, he said. "And get me a patient count. Anyone who can be moved to the inner ward, move them. Quietly. I don't want the primary ward showing empty to anyone checking the sensor grid." Thavi's eyes went wide, then settled into something focused and clear. She left at a speed that was technically not running. Velithik opened his emergency supply cabinet. He was a physician. He had tools. He found the emergency communicator, the one that broadcast on the collective's protected medical frequency, the one that logged automatically to the arbitration network, the one that created a permanent record of whatever was transmitted on it. He tucked it in his coat. Then he went to find out what a wandering human was doing in his corridor. Praxilian found Solis at Junction 4, which was, as the diagram had noted, a natural choke point where the main access corridor narrowed between the supply transfer alcove and the secondary power conduit housing. Solis was standing with her back to the conduit housing, IV stand folded down to half height and held in her right hand like a walking staff, watching the main corridor approach with the focused calm of someone who has spent a great deal of time watching corridors. "You should be in bed," Praxilian said. "Yes," Solis agreed. Praxilian stood beside her. She was not sure why she stood beside her. It was not a decision she had made consciously. Her feet had carried her there and she had arrived, and it had seemed like the correct place to be. She had worked on Station 3 for 23 years, and she had never felt that way about a position in a corridor before. In those 23 years, she had watched beings fight for their lives every day. She had watched them struggle and endure. She had never watched one do it like this, standing quietly in a maintenance corridor, recovering from surgery, treating the corridor with the same matter-of-fact professionalism she might treat a standard shift, as if the situation were not extraordinary but merely the situation at hand. "There are 4 of them on the manifest," Solis said. "If the manifest is accurate, it probably isn't." "How many do you think?" 6, maybe 8, a pause. "They'll want this quiet. Noisy extractions draw attention and they're on a neutral facility, which means they have something to lose if this becomes documented and escalated." She turned her head slightly, checking the side access panel. "That's useful." "How is that useful?" "It means they'll negotiate before they escalate." She glanced sideways at Praxilian. "That gives us time to make negotiating seem like a worse option than leaving." Praxilian processed this. "You want them to choose to leave." "I want them to understand that what they came for is going to cost them more than it's worth." She said it simply, without drama, the way someone describes a calibration procedure. That's usually enough. The math changes, and sensible people update on the math. "And if they aren't sensible?" "Then we hold the corridor," she said, "and we wait for reinforcements." "We don't have reinforcements. We have a medical facility full of people who know how to keep beings alive under adverse conditions." A small, quiet shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "That's not nothing." The lights in the main corridor went out. Not a fluctuation, a deliberate cut, the kind that required access to the station's secondary power management system, which meant whoever was doing this had done their research and had either brought a technical specialist or had someone already inside the station's systems. Both were possible. Neither changed the immediate situation. Praxilian's secondary vision adjusted automatically. Kithari low-light adaptation was a species advantage she had rarely had cause to appreciate in a medical context. Beside her, she heard Solis exhale slowly and deliberately. The human's pupils, Praxilian knew from 17 years of treating humans in difficult conditions, would be dilating to their maximum aperture, maximizing available light intake. The analog biological response that the species had developed before they ever had technology to compensate for darkness. "How's your vision?" Solis asked quietly. "Adequate, yours?" "I've worked in worse." A pause. "Tell me what you see." So Praxilian told her. The Junction 4 corridor empty, the supply alcove doorway sealed. The main approach, 6.4 meters wide at the narrowest point. And here was the thing about Junction 4 that Solis had noted in her diagram, the thing that had made it the choke point rather than simply a narrow section of corridor. The narrowing happened because the wall on the right side jutted inward to accommodate a power conduit housing, and the power conduit housing had a service panel. And behind the service panel was a crawlspace maintenance route that ran parallel to the main corridor all the way to the docking ring access vestibule. The thing you could do from a choke point, if you were patient and had thought about it, was not stand in it and wait to be found. It was know the route around it before anyone else did. "There's a maintenance route," Praxilian said. "I know." Solis was already moving toward the service panel. Slowly, carefully, one hand on the conduit housing for balance. "Give me your tool kit." Praxilian had a tool kit. It lived in her left uniform pocket because she was 23 years into a career that had taught her to have a tool kit within reach at all times. She gave it to Solis without asking why. Solis opened the service panel. The maintenance crawlspace was narrow, designed for the maintenance drones that serviced the power conduits, not for beings of Solis's dimensions. She looked at it for a moment with the same expression she brought to all practical problems. "Stay at this end," she said. "Don't let anyone through the junction in either direction. If they try to negotiate, let them. Keep them talking as long as they'll talk." She looked at Praxilian, and for just a moment something came through the calm that was not calm, not fear, but the awareness of what was being asked and the weight of asking it. "You understand what I'm doing?" Praxilian understood. Solis was going to go through the crawlspace, which meant she was going to put herself between the extraction team and the docking ring access vestibule, which meant she was going to flank them while recovering from abdominal surgery in a compression layer and thin socks. "You'll tear your incision," Praxilian said. "Maybe." She folded herself into the crawlspace with the careful determination of someone who has made a cost-benefit analysis and arrived at an answer they're not happy with but will act on anyway. "The healing membrane's good quality. Your supply team runs a tight procurement." And she was gone. Praxilian stood in the dark corridor with the service panel open behind her and the Junction 4 chokepoint in front of her, and she did something she had not done in 23 years of medical practice. She took a position. She thought briefly about the fact that this was outside her professional scope. She thought about what was inside her professional scope: keeping beings alive under adverse conditions, preventing harm, holding the line when things went wrong. She decided that the distinction was less significant than it had seemed an hour ago. She squared her stance and waited for the extraction team. They came through Junction for 3 minutes after the lights cut, 3 minutes being, Velithic would later calculate, enough time for them to confirm that the security office was not responding, which gave them a reasonable confidence that the station's official response capacity was neutralized. What they had not accounted for, because they had no way to account for it, was Praxilian. She stood in the middle of the corridor at Junction 4. Alone, arms at her sides. The expression on her face, which was technically the expression Velithic classified as professional calm, and which he had seen deployed against panicking patients, difficult family members, and at least one administrator who had tried to reassign her on short notice, was apparently sufficiently alarming in context that the lead extraction agent, a tall Dekari male with the armored vest of his profession and the careful eyes of someone who had done this many times before, stopped a full meter and a half short of where he would have needed to stop if she had been only a nurse. "Medical personnel," Praxilian said. "Yathara Collective Station 3. This is a neutral facility. You are not authorized to proceed." "We're not here for trouble," the lead agent said, which was what people said when they were very much here for trouble and wished to delay the acknowledgement of that fact. "We have a contract retrieval order for a human, Solis, transferred to this station from the frontier skirmish zone 3 days. You do not have authorization to pursue a retrieval action within a Yathara collective facility." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "This is documented under the Galleon Accord, ratified by the Dekari Contractors Guild on," she named a date. It was, Velithic would later discover, accurate to within 6 days. Praxilian had looked it up in the 3 minutes between the lights going out and the extraction team reaching Junction 4, which said something about the relative efficiency of a 23-year medical veteran under stress. Any retrieval action conducted without collective authorization constitutes a violation of Article 7, which triggers automatic referral to the interfaction arbitration body and the revocation of your firm's neutral facility operating license. The lead agent stared at her. He had not, Velethik suspected, anticipated being cited to on medical treaty law by a nurse in a maintenance corridor during a covert retrieval operation. "Step aside," he said. "No," said Praxilian. And behind her, from the maintenance crawlspace at the far end of Junction 4, a panel came off the wall. The docking ring access vestibule was where it went definitively wrong for the extraction team, because the docking ring access vestibule was where Solis was waiting. She had come through 90 meters of maintenance crawlspace with a healing membrane across her flank and a partial arm immobilizer in Praxilian's toolkit, and she had arrived at the maintenance exit in the docking ring vestibule before the extraction team's rear guard reached it, which was exactly what she had timed it to do. The crawlspace had taken 11 minutes. She had estimated 9. The 2-minute difference was the surgery. The rear guard was 2 people. The front team had waited toward the corridor engagement because they expected resistance from the front, armed security, the kind of resistance that looked like resistance, the kind that comes from the direction you approach. What they had not modeled was the other kind. She didn't fight them. She didn't have the capacity for an extended fight, and she knew it with the same clarity she knew everything about her current physical state, the incision pulling at its lower edge, the left arm that wouldn't carry weight, the post-surgical fatigue that sat behind her eyes and pressed. She didn't fight them. What she did was this. She stepped out of the maintenance hatch into the vestibule with Praxilian's medical scanner in her right hand and the toolkit's emergency plasma cutter. Designed for cutting through jammed emergency hatches, not designed as a weapon, she would tell Velethik later with the perfectly straight face of someone who understood the precise limits of that statement, in her left. And she looked at the 2 rear guards with the expression that 11 nurses had been cataloging under behavior anomalous for 3 days. It was not aggression. It was not threat. It wasn't the expression of someone making a display. It was the expression of someone who had done the math, who had been doing the math for a very long time, who was comfortable with what the math said, and who needed the people across from her to understand this before anyone made a decision they couldn't take back. "Your lead team is being detained at Junction 4 on Article 7 violations," she said. Her voice was even. She was not performing evenness. She simply was. "Your operation is logged and flagged as of 6 minutes ago on the collective's protected medical frequency. You have a decision to make about how this ends." The first guard moved for the weapon at his hip. Solis moved faster. She had been trained in close-quarters engagement before any of the people in this vestibule were old enough to hold a rank, and she had maintained that training the way she maintained everything that mattered through the slow, unglamorous work of repetition, until it lived in her hands and not just her head. What she lacked in current physical capacity, she made up in the fact that she had spent 3 days mapping every sight line and choke point in the station, and she knew exactly where to stand, and exactly where he would be reaching, and exactly what happened in the narrow geometry of this vestibule if she stepped left and he stepped right. The plasma cutter was not a weapon. She did not use it as a weapon. She used the toolkit housing, heavy, dense alloy construction, exactly what it needed to be, and the vestibule wall, and the second guard's moment of recalibration after the first guard went down, and the precise amount of time that recalibration took for a person who had not expected to need to recalibrate. Then she sat down on the deck because standing was not a negotiable option anymore, and she opened the docking ring's external systems through the terminal beside the airlock. The Yathara Collective's patient information literature, which Thavi had brought her on day 2 as reassurance that the collective took patient safety seriously, had included a section on emergency medical authority protocols. The protocols allowed the station's chief medical officer to lock docked vessels to the ring under emergency authority, bypassing standard docking control, in situations where the vessel's presence was determined to constitute a threat to patient welfare. Stories was not the chief medical officer, she was a patient. She sent the lock request under Velethic's access credentials, which were on the open network because he was the chief medical officer, and he needed to be reachable from anywhere in the station. And she attached a 14-second audio recording of the lead guard's statement about the retrieval order, which she had taken on the medical scanner, which had a passive audio function she had discovered on day 1, and which no one had thought to mention was running. The lock confirmed in 4 seconds. She looked at the 2 rear guards. One was sitting against the wall holding his wrist. One was standing with the particular stillness of someone reassessing their situation. "I need you to understand," she said, speaking carefully, managing her breathing, "that I don't want either of you to make this worse than it is. Article 7 violations are arbitration matters. They're not criminal. Your firm pays a fine, loses the license for 6 months, probably gets reinstated." She paused. "That's the math right now. The math gets different if this keeps going." Another pause. "I'd like the math to stay where it is." The standing guard looked at her. She looked back. He sat down. She contacted the station security office through the vestibule terminal. This time, someone answered. The shift change had completed, and the night officer was at his post. She told him what had happened, where the extraction team was, and what documentation existed. She told him it was logged on the collective's protected frequency and had already been transmitted to the arbitration network. She told him the docking ring was locked. Then she leaned her head back against the vestibule wall and waited, which she was very good at, and which cost her less than standing had cost her, and which allowed her to conduct a careful inventory of what the crawlspace had done to her body. The incision had held, the membrane had held, the arm immobilizer had held. These were the relevant facts. Everything else was a bill she would pay later. Velethic found her 40 minutes after that. The security team had arrived and processed the extraction team through the station's holding protocols. Praxilian had submitted a documented account of the Article 7 violation that was, by universal agreement, going to cause significant legal difficulties for the Dekari firm. 2 nurses had overseen the move of the inner ward patients back to their rooms, and Thavi had personally checked every monitoring unit in the ward before allowing herself to be redirected to room 14 to wait. Stories was in the vestibule. She had moved from the deck to the secondary bench along the vestibule wall, which was a minimal improvement. She was looking at the external viewport, which showed the locked extraction vessel, and beyond it the geometry of space. The scatter of navigation lights from the station's approach grid doing what navigation lights had always done, marking the way through, steady and indifferent. He sat down on the bench beside her. He did not have a stool, he sat on the bench. She didn't look over, but she knew he was there. "Your incision," he said. "It held. The membrane is doing its job." She paused. "Good supply chain." He looked at her profile, the post-surgical pallor under the brown of her skin, the careful stillness that was managing significant pain rather than not experiencing it, the compression layer with the crawlspace dust on it. "Thavi is going to be extremely upset," he said. "About the crawlspace. About the crawlspace." She exhaled, and it was the most purely human sound he had heard from her in 4 days. A slightly ragged breath that acknowledged, for just a moment, the weight of the past several hours without trying to contain it into something smaller. "I'll apologize." "She won't want an apology," he paused. "She'll want to check your wound mapping." Something happened in Solis's face. The corners of her mouth moved, and this time the micro-expression of amusement was large enough that he felt confident classifying it without consulting his reference files. "Tell her I'll allow it." They sat quietly. Through the viewport, a docking tug was beginning the slow work of managing the locked extraction vessel's position relative to the station's arbitration hold berths. Red navigational markers blinked in steady rhythm. "Why did my nurses keep visiting you?" Velithik said. He had asked it before. She had said she didn't know that he should ask them. He had asked them. Their answers had been, as he had told her, not particularly illuminating. He was asking her again because the context was different and he thought perhaps she would answer differently. She was quiet for a long time. He waited. He was learning to wait in the way she waited without filling the space. "I don't know how much you know about the work I was doing before the transfer," she said. "The file has gaps." "The file has gaps on purpose, not defensive, factual. I was running protection details on civilian infrastructure in contested zones, facilities like this one, except not neutral facilities that were in the middle of things and trying to keep functioning anyway." She looked at the viewport. "It's not combat in the way people picture combat. It's mostly waiting, watching, knowing the shape of a place." She shifted slightly. He saw the controlled nature of the shift, the careful management of what she was allowing herself to feel physically. The people in those facilities, the ones who weren't soldiers, the ones who were just trying to do their work in the middle of something they didn't choose, they knew something was wrong the moment a protection detail arrived. Because if you needed protection, it meant something bad was already close. She paused. So you had to be very careful about how you were there, because if you were afraid, they were more afraid. If you were angry, they were more frightened. If you were cold, she stopped. Started differently. They were already carrying enough. Velithik listened. "The only thing you could give them," she said, "was the feeling that someone was handling it, not that everything was fine, not a lie, just," she searched for the word, "steadiness. That someone had looked at the problem and was thinking about the problem and was going to be there with the problem no matter what it turned out to be." She turned her head to look at him. "I think your nurses have been working in a medical facility for a long time. They know when something is wrong. They came in to check my vitals and they found someone who was," she paused again, "quiet, and they didn't quite know what to make of it." Velithik thought about this. "My assessment would be," he said slowly, "that medical professionals frequently encounter the inverse, patients who are afraid and whose fear requires management as well as their medical condition. Your fear required no management." "I was afraid," she said simply. "I was very afraid. I just had something to do with it." He looked at her for a moment. "That," he said, "I think is what was anomalous." She stayed 4 more days. Not 6, which was what the surgical recovery protocol specified. 4, which was what Solis determined was adequate before she began chafing against the bed rest with the controlled but unmistakable restlessness of someone who has never been very good at being still and has been still longer than she intended. He had seen the restraint she exercised over those 4 days. The reading, the conversation, the careful cooperation with Thavi's 3 times daily wound checks and Orthan's follow-up mapping sessions, which had evolved from medical monitoring into something that both of them seemed to find genuinely interesting about the other. She was being still because she was choosing to be still, and the choice had a cost, and 4 days was the honest answer about when the cost stopped being worth it. He did not try to extend the stay to 6 days. On the 3rd day after the incident, she produced a document, 4 pages, technical and precise, covering the emergency protocol gap she had identified, the handoff failure between external security response and internal medical authority, the exact gap that had made the previous days possible. It included specific recommended modifications, the relevant regulatory citations, and a proposed update to the station's standing emergency procedures. She gave it to Praxilian, who gave it to the security chief, who forwarded it to the station administrator, who sent it to the Yathara Collective's emergency protocols office with a note that it had come from a patient. The protocols office wrote back within 12 hours, asking who the patient was and whether she would be available for a follow-up consultation. "You're going to have a meeting request," Velithik told her on the morning of the 4th day. "I'll be in transit," she said. She was packing the small bag that had arrived with the emergency transfer. The compression layer Praxilian had retrieved. The reference texts Thavi had brought. A small thing that Orthan had made, a model of a Kithari vascular mapping diagram, intricate and precise, the anatomical difference rendered in 3 dimensions, a gift from someone who thought things were worth understanding properly. She packed it carefully, in the center of the bag, surrounded by softer items. "The protocol's office seems to consider the matter significant," he said. "Good, it is significant." She sealed the bag. "They can implement it without me. The work is in the document." He watched her. Thavi was standing in the doorway, and Orthan and Praxilian and the others had found reasons to be in the corridor outside, which was not technically a gathering but was functionally one. "Where are you going?" Orthan asked. Solis put the bag on her shoulder. The movement was more careful than it had been a week ago, and less careful than it had been the morning after the crawlspace. The body finding its range again. She considered Orthan's question with the same unhurried attention she brought to all questions. "Wherever needs the shape of a place known," she said. She walked to the door. At the doorway she paused, turned. "Thavi," she said. Thavi straightened. "The vascular mapping on the primary conduit," Solis said. "You were right that it runs higher in the lateral axis than the reference texts specify. The texts are averaging across population samples. Individual variation is wider than they account for." A pause. "I thought you should know, for future patients." Thavi stared at her. Solis left. Velithik stood at the window of his office an hour later and watched the shuttle departure track from the external viewport. The shuttle was small and unremarkable and moved through the approach grid with the ordinary efficiency of the transport network, joining the flow of vessels and becoming indistinguishable from them, and then resolving into the simple fact of a vessel departing, which was the most ordinary thing that happened on a station every hour of every day. He turned back to his desk. On it was the nursing log from room 14, which he had printed because he found he wanted the physical record, the actual paper of it that he could hold. 11 nurses over 6 days. The notes they had filed. The visit durations and the stated reasons and the observations underneath the stated reasons. The ones that had been accumulating since day 1, without any of them quite knowing what they were accumulating. Patient appears calm, unable to identify cause. Patient interaction non-standard. Behavior requires further observation. Patient in apparent distress denied when asked. Observation continued. That last one was Praxilian. Day 2. The distress she had noted was real. It was what Solis had been doing with the problem she was waiting for, the one she'd spent 3 days mapping from a hospital room, and the denial was real too, not because Solis was hiding it, but because she had decided, deliberately and specifically, not to give it to anyone else to carry. They had all come into the room looking for something to do for her. They had left understanding each time that what she needed most was what she had least interest in asking for, to be seen clearly, without fuss, to have the lights at 30%, to have the compression layer, to be trusted with the information when there was information worth having. And so they had kept coming back. Velithik folded the log and put it in the desk drawer, where he kept the things he thought about. He opened his patient records and pulled up the next admission, a Kithari freighter crew member with a compound injury and a history, flagged in the transfer notes, of difficult interactions with medical staff. The notes described uncooperative behavior, non-compliance, volatility under examination. He read the notes. He thought about what he had learned this week about the difference between steadiness and the absence of fear. He thought about what it cost to be steady. He thought about the difference between a patient who was afraid and a patient whose fear had somewhere to go. He rolled the stool out from behind the desk. He went down the hall. The ward had its ordinary sounds back, monitors, the soft passage of carts, the particular hum of a station going about its work. Praxilian was at the central station updating the emergency protocol documentation. Thavi was at the supply cabinet pulling calibration materials. Orthan was charting. He knocked on the door panel of the new admissions room. The crew member looked up. The wariness was there, layered, old, the kind that had accumulated across too many difficult encounters, with too many people who had approached him as a problem to be managed rather than a patient to be helped. "Hello," Velithik said. He moved the stool into position beside the bed and he sat down, eye level, same height. "I'm Dr. Velithik. I've read your file and I have some questions, but I thought I'd start by asking how you're doing." The wariness shifted, fractionally. The way things shift when something expected does not arrive and something unexpected does instead. "I'm in pain," the crew member said. "I know," Velithik said. "Tell me about it." And he listened. Outside, the station turned in its slow orbit, navigation lights doing what they had always done. In the inner ward, 3 nurses were reviewing the updated emergency handoff protocol that a human had left behind. In the supply storage, Praxilian was logging a compression layer into the standard patient comfort supplies inventory, updating, with characteristic exactness, the documentation to reflect what had already been true for a week. And somewhere past the sensor range, in the ordinary current of vessels going about the ordinary business of a galaxy in motion, a shuttle was carrying a human who had spent 4 days being still and was in motion again. Knowing the shape of a place. Being there with the problem. Giving fear something to do. The galaxy did not know, and would not know, how often it was held steady by people like that. People who had done the math and were comfortable with what it said. People who mapped the exits not out of paranoia, but out of the deep, patient understanding that the exits were where you were needed when it mattered. People who asked for the lights at 30% and nothing else, and somehow, in the asking for nothing, created the space in which everything else became possible. It didn't know. It rarely did. But the ones who needed it, the ones who were afraid, in pain, trying to do their work in the middle of something they hadn't chosen, they recognized it without knowing why. They felt it in the room. They found themselves coming back to it, finding reasons, filing reports that didn't quite explain the thing they were trying to explain, because the thing itself was not complicated, but it was uncommon. It was someone who had decided, a long time ago, that fear was a thing you worked with rather than a thing you put down on the nearest surface. It was someone who knew the shape of a place. It was human through and through, though the humans would likely say that was too simple an answer. They were probably right. Velithik had 17 more years of practice ahead of him, and he suspected he would spend all of them thinking about the 7 days Corporal Marin Solis, retired, had spent in room 14, and what it had meant that 11 nurses had found their way to her door without quite knowing why. He knew why now. He thought maybe Thavi had known since day one, when she'd adjusted the IV calibration and found herself sitting down and asking questions and not leaving. He thought maybe Praxilian had known from the moment she stood in a dark corridor and planted her feet and decided that was where she was supposed to be. He thought the knowing had nothing to do with species and everything to do with a certain quality of presence that some beings carried and most didn't, and that he had spent 17 years treating patients without ever expecting to find it in one. He had adjusted his expectations. He kept the stool beside the bed from then on. He thought about what the crew member had said. The words themselves were ordinary, "I'm in pain," but the way he'd said it, the slight hesitation before it, the surprise that Velithik had asked, that was not ordinary. It was the surprise of someone who has answered that question too many times to a room that wasn't listening. Velithik listened. He thought, while the crew member talked, about the particular gift of being heard without being managed. He thought about what it cost to give that gift, not much objectively in terms of time or resources, but something specific that not everyone had the patience for. The stillness required. The willingness to not fill the silence too quickly. He thought about Solis writing xenobiology notes in the margin of Thavi's reference texts. He thought about the Kithari vascular diagram sitting in the bottom of a travel bag on a shuttle going somewhere that needed someone to know the shape of a place. He thought about the crawlspace and the plasma cutter, and the way she had sat down on the vestibule deck afterward with the same undramatic practicality with which she had done everything else. He thought about the compression layer, the smallest thing. The thing Praxilian had done without being asked, which was itself unusual, and which had been prompted by something she couldn't quite articulate, something about the quality of the room when she walked in, something about a patient who was not performing wellness and was not performing suffering either, who was simply occupying her situation and handling it. You could feel it. That was the thing. You walked into the room and you felt it, not ease, not absence of difficulty, but something solid underneath. A presence that had accounted for the difficulty and had not flinched from the accounting. Medical professionals spent their careers in rooms where beings were at their most fragile. They became very good at reading what was under the surface. And what was under the surface of room 14, for 6 days, was a human who had looked at a problem that included her own body's current limitations, and an extraction team coming for her through a neutral station, and the specific loneliness of being the only person of your species in a medical ward that had no established protocols for what you were, and had made of it all exactly this. A list of exits, a 3-minute window, 90 meters of crawlspace, and the phone number for station security. The crew member was still talking. Velithik was still listening. This, too, was something. This quiet attention. This stool at the bedside, this eye-level approach, this starting with "how are you doing" rather than "here is what we will do to you." He had learned it from a book years ago and practiced it until it was habit. He thought about what it meant that a habit learned from a book, practiced for years, had been reflected back at him by a retired corporal who had learned it differently, who had learned it in the hard school of being present in places where people were afraid, and discovering that the most important thing he could offer was not the absence of danger, but the steady presence of someone who had seen the danger clearly and had not left. The crew member ran out of words. He looked at Velithik with the careful look of someone who has said more than he intended. "Thank you," Velithik said. "That helps me understand what we're dealing with." The wariness came back slightly. "What are we dealing with?" "A manageable injury with a recovery path I think you'll find more bearable than what you've experienced at other facilities." He pulled up the chart. "I'd like to walk you through the treatment plan, and I'd like to do it slowly enough that you can ask questions as we go. We're not in a hurry." The crew member looked at him. "Most doctors are in a hurry," he said. "Most doctors have too many patients," Velithik agreed. "That's also true here, but the hurry doesn't help. I've been reconsidering some of my standard procedures." It was true. He had been reconsidering them since the morning Praxilian had filed a note reading "patient observation, behavior anomalous," about a human who was quiet, who had asked for the lights at 30%, who had listened when people talked to her, and remembered what they said, and said it back in the form of information that was useful to them. He had been reconsidering the idea that ordinary care was ordinary, that the routine of it didn't matter, that what happened in the everyday encounters, the approach to the bed, the level of the stool, the question asked before the explanation given, was just filler between the significant moments. Solis had held a corridor while recovering from surgery. That was significant. But she had also, for 6 days, done something quieter. She had been so entirely herself, so entirely present with the difficulty of her situation without making the difficulty someone else's problem, that 11 nurses had found their way to her door looking for something they couldn't name. The significant and the quiet were the same thing, just at different volumes. He walked the crew member through the treatment plan. He went slowly. He let the questions come. Outside the room, the ward continued its work, monitors and carts and the soft passage of a shift. And in the corridor, Thavi passed with a supply kit and glanced through the room window and saw the stool and the unhurried conversation and kept walking, because everything was in order, because the shape of the place was right.